The glow off the instrument panel turned everything orange. Hands, kneeboard, the rim of the canopy, all of it soaked in that dull amber light while the ground below stayed perfectly black. No moon, no horizon line, just the afterburner heat washing back against the fuselage and the noise of a Pratt & Whitney J-57 trying to shove 37,000 feet of dark air out of the way. How does a fighter designed in 1953, an interceptor built to kill Soviet bombers over Alaska, end up flying combat air patrol above the Red River Delta? How does North Vietnam's increasingly lethal air defense network, packed with SA-2s and radar-guided AAA and MiG-21s, fail to bring down a single F-102 on a night mission? What kept the Delta Dagger alive when faster, newer aircraft caught hell in the same airspace? The short answer is that almost everything about the F-102's design, its speed profile, its radar, its altitude ceiling, its operational timing, accidentally matched the one gap North Vietnamese defenses couldn't close. The long answer takes a while. Captain William Grubaugh flew night intercept sorties out of Da Nang in 1968. He described the experience in terms that stuck with the maintenance crews who heard him talk about it afterward. Like flying inside a coffin with the lid nailed shut and someone occasionally firing a flashbulb through the wood. The flashbulbs were flak bursts. They detonated below and behind, always behind, because the Delta Dagger at military power covered ground faster than the tracking solutions NVA gunners could generate in darkness. There's more to this story than I can fit in one video. If you want the rest, hit subscribe so the next part finds you. Drop a like if Cold War aviation gets your blood moving. And if you've got a detail I'm missing, a unit history, a maintenance log, a name, put it in the comments. Grubaugh flew 14 night sorties, took ground fire on 9 of them, never once brought the aircraft home with a hole in it. The NVA fired thousands of rounds into the dark above their own positions, trying to hit these things. Their after-action reports from the period use a specific phrase that translates roughly as pursuing shadows. The frustration on the receiving end was real. The F-102 shouldn't have worked in Vietnam. It did. Convair's engineers were already arguing about the wing shape when the Korean War ended. The whole program, Project MX-1525, later redesignated the F-102, existed to solve exactly one problem: Soviet nuclear bombers crossing the Arctic Circle at high altitude. Everything about the aircraft pointed north. The MG-10 fire control system locked onto targets autonomously, computed a lead angle, and launched Falcon missiles without the pilot touching a weapon switch. You didn't dogfight in a Delta Dagger. You climbed to 45,000 feet, pointed the nose at a bear or a bison, let the radar do its job, and went home. The airframe reflected that mission down to the rivets. It carried no gun and no external hardpoints in the original configuration. A delta wing optimized for supersonic dash above 50,000 feet, not for turning. The intake geometry choked at low altitude, costing the engine nearly 20% of its rated thrust below 10,000 feet. Convair built a high-altitude Sprinter and made zero apologies for it. By 1962, the F-106 had replaced it in frontline air defense command squadrons across the continental United States. Delta Daggers got shuffled to Air National Guard units and overseas deployments nobody considered prestigious: Germany, Iceland, the Netherlands, Turkey, parking lots for an aging interceptor waiting to be retired. Then Lyndon Johnson needed airplanes in Southeast Asia. The decision chain that put F-102s at Tan Son Nhut and Da Nang reads like a procurement comedy. Pacific Air Forces wanted more F-4s. The Pentagon couldn't spare them. European commitments ate the production line. Somebody at 13th Air Force Headquarters suggested pulling Delta Daggers from Air Defense Command's reserve inventory, and the suggestion climbed through 3 levels of bureaucracy before anyone with tactical experience saw it. The declassified staff memo from March 1962 calls the F-102 a suitable interim platform for air defense alert duties. Suitable. For a jet that couldn't carry bombs, couldn't strafe, couldn't maneuver below 15,000 feet without the pilot sweating through his G-suit. The first detachment arrived in 1962. 6 aircraft from the 509th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, out of Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Their orders specified a single task: sit on alert, scramble if enemy aircraft approached South Vietnamese airspace. They weren't expected to fly north, let alone fight. I think the Pentagon assumed they'd rot on the ramp for 6 months and come home. Instead, the air war escalated. MiG-21s started flying night sorties out of Phu Quyen and Kep, and suddenly, the only American fighter in theater with an all-weather radar and infrared missile capability sat right there on the tarmac, fueled and armed, waiting for exactly the mission it had trained for since 1956. November 3rd, 1962, 11:14 local time. The first 2 Delta Daggers touched concrete at Bien Hoa Air Base, 17 miles northeast of Saigon. Ground crews from the 509th watched them taxi in and immediately started complaining about the heat. Not the weather, the airframe skin temperature after a low-altitude transit from Clark. The Delta wing absorbed solar radiation like a griddle, and maintenance personnel burned their hands on inspection panels for the first 2 weeks until someone requisitioned asbestos gloves from a Navy supply depot. 6 aircraft total by November 9th. 2 spares, 4 on rotating alert status. The alert configuration looked almost identical to what these pilots had practiced stateside for years. 2 Falcon missiles in the weapons bay, the MG-10 radar warmed and calibrated, a pilot in the ready shack playing cards until the klaxon sounded. PACAF hadn't reinvented anything. They copied the Air Defense Command scramble template and dropped it into a tropical combat zone. What they did change mattered more than what they kept. The infrared search and track system, the IRST mounted in a small dome forward of the windscreen, had always played second fiddle to the main radar back in ADC service. Arctic intercepts happened at long range against big targets. You picked up a Tu-95 on radar at 40 miles and never bothered with the IR sensor. In Vietnam, PACAF's tactical planners realized that the IRST gave the Delta Dagger something no other fighter in theater possessed: a completely passive detection mode. No radar emissions for enemy signals intelligence to intercept. No electronic signature at all. The F-102 could hunt in silence. By December, maintenance officers at Bien Hoa had recalibrated every IRST unit in the detachment for tropical atmospheric conditions. The stock factory settings assumed sub-zero temperatures at intercept altitude, Arctic parameters. Southeast Asian air at 35,000 feet ran warmer, more humid, loaded with particulates from monsoon convection. The recalibration took 3 weeks of flight testing and a technical manual that didn't exist yet. Staff Sergeant Robert Koenig wrote it. 47 pages, hand-typed, carbon-copied, distributed to every crew chief in the unit. The Air Force never officially published it. Koenig's manual stayed informal and unauthorized, but indispensable for the next 6 years. If the NVA had started flying night intercepts in late '62, the Delta Daggers would have caught them cold. A MiG-21's Tumansky R-11 engine threw an exhaust plume above 600 degrees Celsius. Against a dark sky from above, with a properly calibrated IRST, that engine lit up like a road flare on the scope. The NVA didn't fly at night yet, not in '62. Their MiG force barely flew in daylight that year, still training, still absorbing Soviet doctrine that emphasized ground-controlled intercept over pilot initiative. So, 4 Delta Daggers sat on alert at Bien Hoa through the dry season, scrambled twice on false alarms, and flew a combined total of 31 uneventful night patrols before the monsoon shut down flight operations in May. The pilots rotated back to Clark. The maintenance logs from that first deployment note: 0 combat engagements, 0 missile launches, 0 encounters. 1 aircraft suffered a hydraulic failure on landing. That constituted the most dramatic event of the entire rotation. The fighting came later, and the F-102's strange advantages came with it. Colonel Robert Grubb pushed his chair back from the briefing table at Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base and told the room what 7th Air Force had just authorized: night interdiction along Route Pac 1, single ship sorties, F-102s only. The pilots stared at him. One of them laughed. Grubb commanded the 509th's forward detachment in 1966 And the order landing on his desk that October contradicted everything the Delta Dagger community had practiced for a decade. Interdiction meant flying low over enemy supply routes, finding trucks and convoys moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail under darkness, and, here the absurdity peaked, doing something about them. The F-102 carried no bombs and no gun. Its Falcon missiles tracked aerial targets, not ground vehicles. Grubb's aircraft could find things in the dark but couldn't kill them on the ground. 7th Air Force knew this. They wanted the finding part. Delta Daggers would fly the route at high speed, mark active convoy segments with their radar, report coordinates on egress, and let follow-on strikes from F-105s handle the killing. An airborne scout with a Mach 1.2 top speed and a radar designed to track Soviet bombers, repurposed to count truck headlights on a jungle road. Grubb ran the numbers on NVA air defenses along the trail. By late '66, the corridor between Mujia Pass and the Laotian border bristled with 37mm and 57mm anti-aircraft batteries. Over 200 confirmed positions according to reconnaissance photography from that month. Their fire control depended on sound detection and optical tracking at night. No radar-directed guns south of the 20th parallel yet. The gap between what the guns could do and what the Delta Dagger demanded of them was everything. The doctrine Grubb developed filled exactly 4 pages. Speed over stealth, ingress at 38,000 feet, descend to 22,000 over the target corridor. Maintain 450 knots minimum ground speed throughout the run. At that velocity and altitude, an NVA gun crew, hearing the engine noise overhead, had roughly 11 seconds to traverse their weapon. Estimate altitude by sound alone, set a fuse time, and fire. Soviet training manuals from the period prescribed a minimum 18-second engagement sequence for optically directed 57mm fire against a crossing target. Grubb's pilots gave them 11. The first sortie launched November 2, 1966. Captain Dennis Moran took off from Udorn at 8:43 p.m., climbed to 38,000 feet, and crossed into North Vietnamese airspace 12 minutes later with his radar sweeping a 20-mile corridor below. He flew the entire route in 41 minutes. Ground fire came up 4 times. He saw the muzzle flashes through the canopy, orange blooms punching through the black canopy of jungle, always behind and below. The rounds detonated at least 3,000 feet under his altitude. Moran reported 17 vehicle concentrations along a 40-mile stretch of Route 12. F-105s hit the coordinates before dawn and confirmed 9 destroyed trucks. Grubb sent 2 more sorties the following night, then 3 the night after. By December, the 509th averaged 4-night interdiction. Runs per week along the trail network. Not one aircraft took a hit. The NVA tried adjusting, repositioning batteries closer to known ingress points, firing barrage patterns at preset altitudes. Their after-action assessments from this period acknowledged the problem with clinical frustration. A translated summary in the Air Force's Southeast Asia Tactical Analysis file describes the American night aircraft as occupying an engagement envelope beyond effective response parameters. They couldn't shoot fast enough, high enough, or accurately enough to touch a Delta Dagger at speed and altitude in total darkness. Grubb's 4-page doctrine held through the entire winter campaign. 11 seconds versus 18. The math never changed, and neither did the outcome. The oxygen mask smelled like rubber and sweat after the first hour. That smell never changed across 6 years of deployments. Every pilot who flew the deuce over the trail mentions it, and none of them got used to it. The mask pressed hard against the bridge of the nose, fogged the edges of the canopy when the defrost system lagged, and forced every breath into a mechanical rhythm that synchronized, after enough sorties, with the low-frequency vibration coming up through the ejection seat from the J-57 engine behind and below. At Mach 1.1, 22,000 feet, the cockpit hummed, not roared. The Delta Dagger's intake ducting smoothed out the compressor noise at supersonic cruise into something closer to a sustained organ tone felt in the sternum more than heard through the helmet. The instrument panel threw amber light across everything forward of the pilot's shoulders. The IR scope sat to the right, its circular display painting slow green sweeps that flared white when something hot crossed the sensor's field of view. A truck convoy running blackout on Route 15 still leaked heat from engines, exhaust pipes, tire friction. The IRST picked up clusters of thermal signatures at 12 to 15 miles in clear air. Behind the canopy, the ground offered nothing. No horizon line, no city glow. Just black. The sensation of speed disappeared entirely without visual reference. Pilots described it as sitting in a vibrating closet watching a green circle while somebody intermittently tried to kill you from below. The trying looked like this, a sudden chain of white flashes in the peripheral vision, always below and behind, sometimes orange, sometimes pure white, depending on the caliber. 37mm rounds burned yellowish. 57mm threw a harder, whiter flash at detonation. Both arrived late. The Delta Dagger's ground speed at cruise exceeded the traverse rate of every manually aimed weapon the NVA fielded along the trail corridor. By the time a gun crew registered engine noise overhead, computed a bearing, elevated the barrel, and fired, the aircraft had moved more than 3,000 feet laterally from the point of sound origin. They shot at where the deuce had been. Consistently, predictably, uselessly. Captain William Patton flew 27 night interdiction sorties between December 1966 and March 1967. He told debriefers at Udorn that the ground fire felt like a fireworks show happening in another county. The assessment section of his post-deployment report uses the phrase, "No engagement achieved effective proximity." 27 sorties, and the closest burst Patton ever recorded detonated an estimated 2,000 feet below and half a mile behind his aircraft. The NVA's fundamental problem had no solution within their existing equipment. Radar-directed fire control could have closed the gap. Tracking an aircraft electronically rather than acoustically eliminates the lag between detection and firing solution. Soviet-made fire can radars existed in North Vietnamese inventory by '66, deployed around Hanoi and Haiphong. None sat along the trail. The logistics of moving and powering radar installations through jungle terrain kept them concentrated around strategic targets in the north. The trail stayed dark, and the guns stayed manual. The deuce flew through all of it untouched. The rain hit the canopy like gravel. February 5th, 1968. Tet Offensive, third day, and the weather over Da Nang had turned into a gray wall of water that reduced visibility to less than a quarter mile on the ground. Lieutenant Wallace Wiggins taxied his F-102 onto the active runway at 11:40 p.m., with the windscreen wipers beating uselessly against sheets of monsoon rain he couldn't see through and didn't need to. The MG-10 radar painted everything forward. The IRST handled the rest. Wiggins had flown 14 night sorties without incident. He carried 2 AIM-4D Falcon infrared missiles in the weapons bay and enough fuel for 90 minutes on station. Ground control at Da Nang vectored him northwest toward a reported low-altitude contact, moving south along the coast. The contact flew at 8,000 feet, fast, intermittent on radar. GCY classified it as a probable MiG-21 out of Phuc Yen running a harassment sortie against the Marine positions at Hue. Wiggins pushed the throttle forward and climbed through 25,000 feet to set up an overhead intercept. Standard ADC geometry, diving attack from above and behind, let the Falcon's seeker head lock onto the target's exhaust plume. He never made the intercept. A second MiG-21, undetected, running dark, no radar emissions, sat at 30,000 feet above the cloud layer. North Vietnamese ground controllers had positioned it there 40 minutes earlier. The tactical setup represented something new. A deliberate high-low trap using 2 aircraft, with the low MiG as bait and the high MiG as killer. Soviet advisors at Phuc Yen had designed the tactic specifically for use against American night fighters operating alone. The translated planning document references single-engine American interceptors conducting unescorted patrols. They meant the F-102. Wiggins descended through 20,000 feet with his radar locked on the low contact. The high MiG rolled in behind him from above. The engagement took less than 15 seconds. An atoll heat-seeking missile, the Soviet K-13, a reverse-engineered copy of the American AIM-9 Sidewinder, struck the F-102's tail section and detonated against the engine bay. Wiggins ejected. He came down in jungle canopy southwest of Hue, broke his left leg on landing, and spent 6 hours on the ground before a Marine helicopter extracted him at dawn. The aircraft burned on impact. Tail number 561009. I think the loss shook the Delta Dagger community harder than it should have. One aircraft in 6 years of night operations over the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The statistical record bordered on absurd. Hundreds of sorties into AAA corridors, 0 losses to ground fire, 0 losses to weather, and then a single MiG-21 ambush during the most chaotic week of the entire war. 7th Air Force grounded night interdiction sorties for 11 days while intelligence assessed whether the NVA had developed a systematic counter tactic or gotten lucky once. The assessment concluded it fell somewhere between. NVA night fighter operations remained primitive by any standard. Their GCI controllers communicated on open frequencies that American signals intelligence monitored in real time. The high-low trap required precise timing, cooperative weather, and a target flying a predictable route, conditions that aligned on February 5th and rarely repeated. After Tet, the 509th resumed night operations with one modification to Grubb's doctrine: randomized altitude blocks. No 2 consecutive sorties flew the same profile. The predictability that killed 561009 disappeared from the flight plans. Wiggins returned to flight status in June. He flew 11 more night sorties before rotating home in September. Look at the full record. From 1962 through 1969, F-102s flew over 500 documented night combat sorties in Southeast Asia. Sources conflict on the exact total. PACAF, records list 512, while the 509th's unit history counts 487, likely due to different classification criteria for what constituted a combat sortie versus a training patrol. 1 aircraft lost to enemy action. 1 pilot injured, recovered, returned to duty. The NVA threw thousands of anti-aircraft rounds into the dark sky above the trail, positioned their best Soviet-trained pilots in MiG-21s with infrared missiles, designed specific tactical traps for the Deuce, and managed to bring down exactly 1. The F-102 proved something the Air Force didn't fully understand until years later. An aircraft designed for one mission, Arctic intercept, nuclear defense, Cold War standoff patrols over Alaska, had wandered into the wrong war and accidentally demonstrated the single most important principle in modern American air combat. Whoever owns the night owns the sky. The 1971 PACAF Tactical Assessment of Night Operations in Southeast Asia states it plainly. The consistent survivability of F-102 aircraft in high-threat nocturnal environments validated sensor-dependent combat as a decisive operational advantage rather than a supplementary capability. Sensor-dependent combat. The phrase carried more weight than anyone writing it probably realized. The Delta Dagger's pilots didn't fly by looking outside. They flew by watching screens, radar sweeps, infrared returns, instrument readings. The canopy might as well have been a wall. Everything that mattered came through electronics, and those electronics operated identically whether the sun hung at noon or the ground below sat in total blackness. The NVA fought a visual war. Their gunners aimed with eyes and ears. Their MiG pilots relied on GCI controllers squinting at primitive radar displays and shouting vectors over open radio channels. Darkness degraded every link in their kill chain. It degraded nothing in the American one. If the SA-2 had deployed along the trail corridor instead of clustering around Hanoi, the calculus changes completely. Radar-guided missiles don't care about darkness. They don't need 18 seconds of manual tracking. The Fansong radar locks a target at 45 kilometers and guides the missile autonomously. Grubb's 11-second window becomes irrelevant against a system that generates a firing solution in 4. The NVA never made that redeployment. Logistics, generator requirements, the vulnerability of radar vans to airstrikes in open jungle, the sheer difficulty of maintaining guidance systems outside fixed installations. All of it conspired to keep the trail defended by weapons that belonged to the previous decade. 17 years after the last F-102 sortie over the trail, an F-117 Nighthawk crossed into Iraqi airspace on January 17, 1991. Same principle. Different execution. The stealth fighter carried no radar of its own, relied on infrared targeting, and struck ground targets that never detected its presence. The technological lineage runs straight and clean, from a 1950s interceptor jury-rigged for jungle reconnaissance to a purpose-built, invisible strike aircraft that opened the most one-sided air campaign in military history. The Delta Dagger crews flying out of Udorn and Da Nang and Bien Hoa had sketched the blueprint in afterburner exhaust and amber instrument light over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 500 sorties. One loss. The NVA fired thousands of rounds into empty air, chasing engine noise that had already passed. American sensors saw through the dark. Nothing on the other side matched it. Major Donald Richards pulled the canopy closed at Udorn on March 14, 1969, ran the MG-10 through its self-test cycle, and taxied for what the squadron operations log lists as a routine night interdiction patrol along Route Pac 1. The F-102 program in Southeast Asia had 7 months left. Nobody told Richards that. He flew the sortie, landed, signed the maintenance form, walked to the officers' club, and ate a plate of eggs. The Deuce left Vietnam the way it arrived, without ceremony, without press coverage, and certainly without a general officer making a speech about what it had done. The last F-102s departed in November 1969. Replaced by F-4 Phantoms that carried more ordnance, flew faster, and required 2 crew members to operate systems the Delta Dagger handled with 1 pilot and a fire control computer designed during the Eisenhower administration. The Phantom got the glory. It earned it too. More kills, more missions, a far more visible presence over North Vietnam during the years the cameras watched. The F-102 operated in darkness, reported results through classified channels, and generated the kind of operational record that disappears into filing cabinets at Maxwell Air Force Base. 76 aircraft deployed to Southeast Asia across the full span of the commitment, not 76 at once. Peak strength never exceeded 24 airframes in theater simultaneously. The 509th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Da Nang, the 509th again at Udorn, detachments rotating through Bien Hoa and Tan Son Nhut. A handful of Cold War interceptors shuffled between bases like borrowed furniture. Maintenance crews kept them flying with parts cannibalized from aircraft already scheduled for retirement. The J-57 engines ate compressor blades in the humid tropical air at twice the rate Pratt & Whitney's engineers had predicted for Arctic operations. Every blade change meant 12 hours of wrench work in open-sided hangars where the temperature hit 105 degrees by noon. The pilots rotated through on standard tours, 12 months, sometimes extended to 14. They flew their night sorties, dodged the AAA that couldn't track them, watched the infrared scope paint truck convoys in green and white, and handed the aircraft to the next crew. The program produced 0 aces and no dramatic kill tallies. The mission profile didn't produce heroes in the traditional sense. It produced statistics, and the statistics said the same thing every month for 6 years running. Sorties flown, targets identified, rounds fired at the aircraft, rounds that connected. The last column stayed at 0 until Wiggins. The 509th's final after-action summary from 1969 runs 43 pages. Most of it covers logistics, fuel consumption rates, spare parts shortages, the chronic problem of AN/AP, Q-66, radar magnetrons failing in high humidity. Buried on page 31, a single paragraph addresses overall mission effectiveness. The document credits the F-102 night interdiction program with disrupting an estimated 12% of total truck traffic along monitored segments of the Ho Chi Minh Trail during peak operational periods. 12% sounds modest until you calculate tonnage across 3 years of continuous operations. Richards flew 4 more night sorties after March 14th, his last debrief at Udorn, transcribed by a staff sergeant whose name the records don't preserve, ends mid-thought. He told the debriefer the trail looked the same as it always did. Black ground, amber instruments, green scope, and trucks that didn't know he could see them.